An unexpected incident at the airport turns an ordinary trip of an 11-year-old girl into a national event. Adults try to hush up the scandal, but her voice is too clear to ignore. Behind the scenes, a battle between the system and conscience begins, in which the truth is the only weapon. And when it seems that everything will calm down, one child changes the rules of the game. Don't forget to subscribe and like, so you don't miss new stories. Harrison International Airport was waking up slowly, noisily, and a little lazily, as if trying to put off the morning. People were filling the terminals, some with coffee, some with suitcases, some with a heap of fuss on their faces. Among these adults, hurried and bulky, a girl stood out, slender, neat, in a blue jacket with a hood and a backpack in the shape of a panda. She walked confidently but without haste, as if she had a clear idea of each next action. Her name was Aisha. She was 11. It wasn't the first time Aisha had flown alone. She already knew where to show her boarding pass, how to find the exit, how to smile politely at the flight attendant when she said, "You're so brave, all alone." She didn't think of herself as brave. She just knew she could be trusted. Her father always said that, "You're smart and grown up, you can handle it." His voice always sounded calm, reserved, as if he were looking down on everything from 10 meters above the ground. He worked for the Department of Homeland Security. Sometimes it seemed as if he worked in the very conscience of the country. Aisha stepped off the plane and walked down the corridor, breathing in the cold air that smelled of metal, coffee, and disinfectant. She had already noticed the exit sign when a tall man in uniform approached her. A TSA agent. His badge read, A. Mansfield. He was not smiling. "Girl," he said, "where are your parents?" "I'm flying alone," Aisha answered calmly and politely. "I have documents, and an escort for the flight." He looked at her a little longer than he should have. Then he held out his hand. "Boarding pass." Aisha silently handed over the blue and white paper, slightly crumpled in the corner. He took it and looked at her again, not as a passenger, not as a child, but as a problem that needed to be classified. "How old are you?" 11. "Who will meet you?" "My aunt. Her name is Lauren Lawrence. She's listed on the cover sheet." Mansfield kept his eyes on the girl. It was as if he expected a glitch, a discrepancy, a tremor in her voice. But Aisha stood straight, her hands at her sides, just like her dad had taught her. Everything about her said, "I know who I am." Mansfield muttered, "That's weird." And without warning, he tore up the boarding pass. The paper made a crunching sound, as if something more than just a document was being torn. "You won't stay here without being checked. I think something's wrong here." "Wait." Aisha froze. She didn't immediately understand what had happened. She only felt a wave of something hot and salty rise in her throat. It wasn't fear, it was surprise and distrust. She knew she had done everything right. "Mister, you have no right," she said quietly but clearly. "It's not legal." He chuckled. "You speak too well, too clearly. It's suspicious." "What's suspicious?" "All." She stood in a small square of tiles. People passed by, some glanced, some stopped, surprised, but no one intervened. Aisha took out her phone, opened her contacts, calling Dad. The voice on the other end rose almost immediately. "Aisha, everything is fine?" "Daddy," she said, her voice not trembling but a little strained. "I was stopped. They said I was suspicious. He tore up my ticket." "Who?" "TSA officer. He says he doesn't believe I'm flying alone, even though I have all the documents." There was a short silence on the other end. That silence when everything becomes crystal clear. "Take a step back. Stand aside. Don't argue. I'll call you now." "Fine." She disconnected the call and stood up. An elderly woman in a pink coat was sitting on a bench nearby. She leaned over. "Are you okay, baby?" "Not quite. But I will be there soon." The woman took a napkin out of her bag and handed it to her. Aisha took it and dabbed her eyes. Not because she was crying, but because she didn't want anyone to think she was afraid. Less than 10 minutes passed. Airport staff, security, and an internal affairs representative showed up at the same time. One of them walked past Mansfield without saying hello. The other went straight to Aisha. "Aisha Lawrence?" "Yes." "Can you come with me?" "Where to?" "Your aunt is on her way, and we have a video recording. We want to settle this." She walked with him without looking back. Left behind was Mansfield, who suddenly realized that he had made more than just a mistake. He had pressed a button that would erase his name from the board. And a door was opening for Aisha, not as a symbol, as a person who had not remained silent. And this was her first choice, her first step. Among hundreds of adults, she was left alone, but not lonely. Aisha's voice, short, clear, not broken but rather collected, went viral. It spread across news feeds, audio snapshots, screens, as if the country itself understood at that moment. This is not just an incident. This is a mirror. Someone heard the child's voice for the first time, not as a victim, not as an accuser, but as a reminder. A reminder of how easy it is to become nothing in someone's eyes, just for one look, for one skin color, for one intonation. The first publications were dry. 11-year-old girl stopped by TSA officer, suspected of having counterfeit documents, no escort, dispute ensued. But then came eyewitness accounts. A conversation, a phrase about too correct speech, footage of a torn boarding pass, and something in these footage broke the usual neutrality of reports. People began sharing the story not out of interest, but out of a feeling that they had encountered this themselves, or their children, or friends, or simply saw it and turned away. Aisha didn't read all the articles. That evening, she was sitting in Aunt Lauren's house, in an easy chair with a mug of mint tea. The TV was on, but the sound was off. There she was, her face, frozen, a little tired, with that expression that had already been called the symbol of silent protest. She wasn't sure she wanted to be a symbol. She just didn't want it to happen to anyone else. Auntie gently stroked her shoulder. Silent. But there was tension in her breathing. She, like Raymond, Aishan's father, already knew. This will not end tomorrow. It cannot end. Because when the system cracks, not only dust falls, but also stars from shoulder straps. And in Washington, in a building where the walls were more like shields, Raymond Lawrence stood at the window of his office. His phone kept ringing. One call was from the Secretary of State's advisor. The second was from the press department. The third was from an extension. They all asked the same question. What are you going to do? He didn't answer, because he knew that if he responded formally now, he would lose both himself and his daughter. He dialed the number. Janet, connect me with the director of the agency. No, not through the press. Directly, right now. Meanwhile, Arlene Mansfield sat in his car by the side of the road, his phone in his lap, his eyes blank. He already knew the girl's name had been leaked. He knew who the father was. And even without the sound, he could hear his career crumbling every time he opened his news app. He tried to remember what had made him snap. Why he'd suddenly decided she was dangerous. But it wasn't a single moment. It was a chain. Years of work, teachings, inner turmoil. His wife didn't answer his calls. His colleagues wrote back with formal phrases. One friend, Jeremy, wrote, "You knew it was unnecessary, and you still went all the way. Don't expect anyone to cover for you." For the first time, Arlen felt out of shape and out of the system. Just a man, tired, scared, and wrong. Conversations began in schools across the country. Teachers asked, "Why do you think this happened?" The kids responded in different ways. Some defended the officer, others defended Aisha. Some remained silent, but they discussed it during breaks. A trend emerged on TikTok. What would you say to Aisha? The videos garnered millions of views. Aisha skimmed through them selectively. She didn't want to become the focus of other people's stories. But there was one voice among the videos, a girl from Texas, also with a panda backpack, saying, "I was afraid to fly alone. Now I'm not afraid, because someone has already done it and didn't break." Raymond, meanwhile, called a meeting. There were 15 people there, department heads, lawyers, outside observers. He stood up and began with a simple phrase, "Today my daughter lost the right to be just a child, because someone decided that she is not like what is written in her papers." Everyone fell silent. He continued, "This is not the first case, but this is the last one for which I am personally responsible." He ordered an audit of all TSA covert procedures, identify phrases that slipped through the cracks, find code marks, check how often passengers with certain names, skin colors, accents were being targeted. And if anything showed signs of systemic bias, expose it. Not cover it up, not smooth it over, expose it. There was resistance. Some said it would undermine trust. Some said it was not the right time in the context of the elections. But Raymond was calm. He did not shout. He simply said, "When my daughter grows up, I don't want her to say, 'You knew, and you didn't do it.'" Aisha was sitting on the floor by the window at the time, drawing. In her notebook, there was an airplane, clouds, and a figure against the glass. A small one, with a panda-shaped backpack, and next to it were the words, "You may be small, but your voice is not." And in that moment, she realized that she might have become more than just a passenger without a boarding pass. She had become someone who was listened to, and therefore, whose word could protect others. Aisha didn't know what it was supposed to feel like to be the center of a nation's attention. She didn't want a stage or applause or big words. She just wasn't left alone. Her voice, spoken quietly without shouting, became a viral code that crept into every airtime slot, every phone, every social media comment. Some called her a hero, others a problem, still others a symbol. But no one asked who she wanted to be. Aunt Lauren's house was quiet, as it can only be in a house where adults understand that noise is a way to forget. But Aisha did not forget. She remembered the officer's face. She remembered holding the torn boarding pass in her palm. She remembered the silence around her. And now, a new silence had appeared within her. Deep, like a room into which strangers do not look. In Washington, Ray Lawrence's office had become a makeshift headquarters. Politicians, lawyers, press secretaries, even former agents he had once personally vetted came to see him. But now he didn't speak like an official, he spoke like a father. "This is not about one girl," he repeated. "This is about a system that fosters fear, not trust. About algorithms in which a name and skin color are already a flag. We did not build a state for children to be afraid of it." He read internal TSA reports, documents scarred with legalese. There were phrases like, "watch for behavioral anomalies," "unusual confidence," and "excessive speech for age." All of these were ostensibly unrelated to race, but the statistics said otherwise. Aisha fit the bill, by their standards. And really, because she was herself. A team of young lawyers worked in parallel. They requested data. How many African American minors had been detained at airports in the past 3 years? How many complaints had gone unanswered? How many had never even reached a paper trail? The answers came slowly, but each one was like a blow: silence, denial, and the occasional confession. Ray held a press conference. He didn't name names. He talked about responsibility, about how security is not a privilege, but a trust, and that his daughter's broken ticket should be followed by reform, not just an apology. The journalists held him for an hour. He held on, but in the end he said, "You ask how I feel as a father. I feel proud, but you should ask how I feel as a citizen. I feel like we're on the edge, either a step forward or back again. I won't let it be chosen for me." At this time, Arlene Mansfield himself had not slept for 2 days. He was staying in a hotel near the airport. At first, he thought that everything would calm down. Then he hoped that they would cover for him. Then he realized that no one would cover for him. His name was already floating around the screens. His photo was in the comments. His family was in a panic. His wife did not want him to come home. His son blocked him in the messenger. Arlene walked around the room, smoked, then tried to compose a letter. "I didn't mean to. It was a mistake. I'm sorry." But it all seemed pointless, not even fake, just belated. One night he went out, just walking through the city. He passed a newspaper stand and saw the headline, "Aisha Speaks. The System Listens." Inside, he heard a crunch, as if someone inside him understood there is no way back. That same morning, Aisha woke up early. In the kitchen, her aunt was already making porridge. The TV was on, and again, her face. But now, there were others next to her, teenagers, students, even adults, who were writing down their stories. Under the title, "I was silent too, but now I'm speaking." Aisha moved closer. There was the boy from Minnesota who had been searched without cause at the supermarket. The girl from Boston who had been turned away from the bus until her real mother arrived. And the old man from Louisiana who had told her how he had been stopped every time he went to work in the 60s. They all said the same thing. "Thanks for telling me first." She didn't feel like a hero. But she knew that her voice was more than just a sound now. It was a bridge between silence and the truth. In his office, Ray received another report, a new directive, the TSA Evaluation Criteria Review Protocol. It was the first brick. A small one, but a real one. He signed the document, put away his glasses, looked out the window and whispered, "Thank you, Aisha. You taught me to speak out loud too." And that was only halfway, but he already knew they were not walking alone. Aisha stood behind the curtains of a large hall, illuminated by hundreds of spotlights. Her palms were cold, but she did not tremble. In front of her, behind a thin screen, sat adults, journalists, activists, reporters, schoolchildren, parents, senators. All of them had gathered not for applause, but for something invisible but important, something that was born from a voice that could no longer be ignored. Aisha already knew she had not chosen this path, but she had the right to go through it to the end. Aunt Lauren came up behind her, put her hands on her shoulders. She leaned in and whispered, "If you don't want to, just say so. No one will judge." Aisha nodded. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew that silence would mean something different right now. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. The light hit her face. The room was silent as she walked onto the stage. No papers, no speeches, just her. "I just wanted to get home," she said, and then she fell silent. The silence lasted for a second. Then, the audience stood up, not out of delight, but out of respect. People stood silently, because it wasn't about words. It was about the spine, about a voice that said exactly as much as needed. The next day, her words were everywhere. They were analyzed by phrases, by facial expressions, by hand movements. But she herself did not pay attention to this. She walked with her aunt in the park, ate ice cream, and finally laughed again like a girl. Simply, like Aisha. Not as a symbol, not as an event. As a person. That same morning, in his cheap motel room, Arlene Mansfield woke to a call. It was his lawyer's voice. He was talking about the details, the internal investigation, the committee's decision, the possibility of early retirement with no option to return. Arlene listened and felt everything crumble. Not on the outside, but on the inside. Not his career, not his status. Himself. An emptiness that had never been there before. He turned off his phone. He looked in the mirror. There was gray hair, tired eyes, hands that remembered how they tore up someone else's document. He felt no anger, only shame, heavy as cement. He put on a simple jacket, took a bus to the Central Library. An old friend of his worked there. She said that Aisha sometimes came there, just to read. And he went, not for the sake of excuses, for the sake of trying. Aisha was sitting by the window, bent over a book. He approached, unrecognized by anyone around, without a uniform. Without a badge, without protection. He stopped quietly next to her. "Hello," he said. "You probably don't want to see me, and I don't know why I came. I just wanted to say I was wrong, not by accident, not because of stress, but because I was used to it, because I thought I had the right. But I didn't." Aisha slowly looked up. There was no fear in her eyes, only an adult, almost adult, seriousness. "I don't hold a grudge," she said. "But that doesn't mean I've forgotten." He nodded. "I'm not asking you to forget. I just thank you for what you said, and I heard it." He left, without relief, but with understanding, and that was enough. A week later, a special commission on TSA protocol reform opened in Washington. The first thing they did was remove all the subjective code categories. The second was to introduce mandatory racial bias prevention training. The third was a public confession and apology, not on screen, at a live event, where the agency's director spoke, where Aisha, her father, Aunt Lauren, and several other children, now unafraid to speak up, sat in the front row. Ray Lawrence did not speak. He sat silently. His work was behind the scenes. He built a system in which truth alone could be the rule. When it was all over, he just hugged his daughter and whispered, "You did what I couldn't. You didn't let the world be deaf." And in the evening, Aisha sat on the steps of the house, listened to the crickets sounding in the darkness, and wrote in a notebook. "When I speak, it doesn't always get easier, but it gets brighter. And that's already something." She didn't need more. She just needed to be heard. And now she knew. One voice could awaken thousands, if it was spoken honestly. 2 months passed. The leaves on the trees began to darken, curling at the edges, like letters burned through by time. Autumn was coming into its own, and it seemed that something in the air itself was changing with it. It was becoming more attentive, slower, quieter. Aisha went to school as before. She wore the same blue jacket, although now everyone recognized her. Children came up to her during breaks, some just to say hello, others to ask what it was like to be really brave. She didn't like the term. She wasn't brave. She just wasn't silent. And now it was part of her, like the color of her skin, like her handwriting, like the posture she'd developed over years of waiting. One morning, just as the sun was breaking through the curtains, Raymond Lawrence spread out the paperwork in front of him. He reviewed reports, lists of new assignments, reviews of updated TSA training courses. It was happening. Not fast, but it was happening. And yet, something inside him wouldn't let him close the file calmly. He got up, went outside, and just drove, without security, without a plan. He arrived at the same airport, Harrison International. He walked through the glass doors, under the same letters as when his daughter had called him with a trembling voice. He looked down the hallways where it all began, and then he saw it, the same bench where she had stood. For a second, he thought he could feel her breath in the air. He sat down, closed his eyes, and just sat. A few days later, an exhibition dedicated to civil equality opened in the city center. One of the halls was decorated as a testimony room. There on the walls were printed excerpts from real messages from children who had experienced discrimination in stores, schools, hospitals, buses. In the center was a bench, like from a terminal. On it was a backpack in the shape of a panda, and above it were words written in a simple black marker on a white background. "I was not a threat. I was just going home." Signed, Aisha, 11 years old. People stood by this bench for a long time. Some were silent, some cried, some took pictures, then put the phone away and just looked. Aisha didn't come to the opening, She didn't want to be part of the exhibition. But one evening, when there was almost no one left in the hall, she and Aunt Lauren went in. She walked slowly to the bench and sat down next to her backpack. She looked at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. She remembered how she had held the torn ticket, how everything inside her had clenched. And now her palms were warm and strong, not because they had grown, but because they were holding someone else's hand. Later she wrote a letter, not to the newspaper, just to herself. It said these words, "I don't think I've changed the world, but I've certainly changed mine. And maybe someone else's mourning, someone else's voice, someone else's silence. If I could go back, I'd stand where I stood, not out of pride, out of a sense that if not me, then who?" She put the letter in the box and didn't send it. It didn't require an addressee. It was simply the truth. Meanwhile, Arlene Mansfield got a job at a shelter for teenagers. He didn't tell them who he was. He just helped, with paperwork, with routes, with passes. One day, a boy, hearing his last name, squinted and said, "And you were the one, right?" Arlen didn't answer right away. He just looked into my eyes and said, "I was the one who made a mistake. And now I want to do it differently." The boy nodded, not with condemnation, with understanding. Because sometimes adults need a place to learn things again, too. At the beginning of winter, Aisha received a letter from a girl in Kansas. She wrote that her mother was a pilot, and she often had to explain that yes, she really was the crew commander, despite her last name and skin color. At the end of the letter was, "If you can do it, I can do it too. Thank you." Aisha held the letter in her hands for a long time, and then she approached her father. "Dad," she said, "and what if one day I want to work in the service like you, but not to guard but to correct?" He smiled. "Then this will be the best day of my life." And she put her blue jacket on again, and she went out into the cold air. The city was the same, but she already knew that it had become a little warmer. Because somewhere on its streets there were now children who were not afraid, and adults who had finally begun to hear.